Welcome back to the Hidden History Happy Hour, everyone. Coming to you. I'm so excited about this. Coming to you from historic Abbey Road Studios in London. Well, not really, but this is the soon-to-be historic Loxa Studios in God's country, Montana/Idaho, USA, and we're here because we have a very special guest. How are you, my friend?
I'm good. I'm not the guest, but I was about to be very offended that you were in London and hadn't told me. I
Well,
am having, in honor of the German story we're about to tell, I'm having some Donhofer. I've mentioned it before on the podcast. It's a very good Riesling. And what are you drinking there?
Well, let me just say I would have been offended if you thought that was actually Abbey Road. So I am drinking. This is actually quite an amazing story. I don't know if I've told it before on the show. It's called Uncle Nearest Whiskey.
Nope, never
It's
heard
an
of it.
American whiskey, and it's made entirely by an African American female family that got the recipe handed down generation upon generation upon generation from their ancestor. And it's very, very good, and it's a great cause. They donate a lot of money to charity, and it's excellent. Uncle Nearest.
Called Uncle Nearest, and it's got 1856 on the bottle, which is their,
Yes.
I assume, when they were founded.
Yeah,
I
with
like
not
it.
not not when this was bottled, I hope, but yes.
Right, right. You've been
So
slamming through it.
no, this is not all my work, and it didn't all happen last night. It took at
Right,
least 2 nights.
or
So
indeed
the
today.
reason we're here in a recording studio, everybody, is we have two amazing musical stories for you today. Alex, what's the first one?
First one is a story I told in volume 2 of the books, More Lessons from History, and it's called That Which Was Lost Came Back. I like people who make jokes about Arnold Schwarzenegger like to pun on Johann Sebastian Bach, who was keen on getting in the good books of the Margrave of Brandenburg Schwelt, Christian Ludwig. And who can blame JSB? Musicians of the age, no matter how distinguished, were dependent upon patronage for an income, or at least if they wanted a decent income. And this particular Margrave, in addition to having, a cool title, was a member of the House of Hohenzollern. And having inherited vast estates, he was seemingly very well heeled. And thus it was that Johann Sebastian Bach gave the Margrave his handwritten score for the Brandenburg Concertos. I didn't mention this in the book, but one of my favorite pieces of music. It was on one happy day in March 1721. We know this because there is this astonishingly oily sort of dedication handwritten across the pages of the original score for the Brandenburg Concertos. And Bach expresses his profound admiration for the Margrave. He doles out the praise in these kind of colossal quantities, which were apparently usual for the era from the artist to the sponsor, but is definitely stomach churning to the modern audience. Anyway, what is rather more to be admired, in my view, as I say, is the contents of the concertos themselves. You pretty much universally held to be amongst the most elegant pieces of classical music,
Yes.
albeit, I mean, and of course, I don't have these skills, but apparently amongst the most difficult pieces to perform, especially, and this is not known, for musicians of Bach's own era, because when Bach wrote the Brandenburg Concertos, trumpets did not have valves. So they were
Uh,
much harder to play than they
Bugles,
are.
basically.
Exactly. So modern musicians don't know how, they don't know how good they've got it. Anyway, and they are almost certainly the earliest and most highfalutin product placement vehicles in the arts, because Bach wrote bits of the Brandenburg concertos played around the world to this day in order to show off the capabilities of his own brand new harpsichord. So he wrote this thing so that he could say, hey, listen to
Amazing.
this bit, tiddle, tiddle, tiddle. And it was just to show what he just got off and bought, which I love because it demonstrates how the vagaries of pride in new stuff can affect his history and historic
Absolutely.
creativity. You might well think, I don't know, buying a massive social media platform and rebranding it from one name to another might play in this sort of thing. It shows how when the new stuff in question is owned by a genius like Bach, then anything is fodder for creativity. And the point is, and I hope this has now been clear, these documents contain beauty and they are important and they are historic. But sadly for Bach's masterwork, he had backed the wrong aristocratic horse. Christian was the son of Frederick William, who was the ruler of Brandenburg, Prussia, and he was no music lover. And Margrave Ludwig was an early sign of things to come, for ostensibly high-living European, relatively minor aristocracy. That is to say, asset-rich, cash-poor. Looks great, but actually don't have the dineros on hand. So the Margrave was dependent upon Daddy for much of his income, and his father was very miserly when it came to music, which meant the Margrave's own abilities to be a sponsor, despite everything nice that Bach wrote about him, Margrave's abilities to put on a good concert were basically nil. So after all that lavish praise, the original score of the Brandenburg Concertos get taken by the Margrave and just shoved in a drawer and gather dust there. And Christian died in 1734, and the devastated grief of his loving and affectionate family was demonstrated by the contents of his estate being promptly auctioned. And the Brandenburg Concertos were sold for approximately 20 quid. And they were thought to be lost until they turned up in the archives of Brandenburg, the place, over 100 years later in
Wow.
1849. So that is why there's this weird quirk in history, and you'll see it if you look it up online or in a reference book. The official publication of the Brandenburg Concertos took place over a century after they were written, because it was the first time that somebody with any interest in doing it could actually find the original score.
Well, wait, so does that mean it was never performed for 100 years, or were there other copies?
It was performed, there were copies, but the originals were
Okay,
shoved
got it.
away. They
Got it.
were not performed as the Margrave had it, and so forth. Somebody went back and found the original manuscripts, the original score. During the Second World War, which is the second, so part two, during the Second World War, of course, amidst the wider human tragedies and great upheavals of my continent, the arts were involved in that great upheaval too. And the Brandenburg original manuscripts were almost lost for good. The librarian who was entrusted with them and responsible for them was taking them eastwards, so away from the Allied advance and the Allied bombing, when the train he was aboard was bombed. And the master's work was preserved by said librarian in two ways. First, by jumping from a moving train. I mean, some librarian, right? Jumping from a moving train and hiding from a forest by the track until the danger had passed. And secondly, by shoving Brandenburg's priceless work up his jumper for safekeeping.
Sure.
So I mean, this is obviously well known to literature and cinema, but librarians can be heroes, which I think is a nice lesson. But the second peculiar thing about that is this. The Voyager space probes, and we've discussed aliens a few times, the
Yeah.
Voyager space probes sent out to proclaim humanity's essential goodness to alien species as yet unknown. I think Voyager is now, it's by miles the furthest from the Earth that anything made by man has ever been. But it's soon going. It's either soon or just has crossed over the point at which the sun's gravity affects it. And once it's beyond that, I mean, it truly is in another space
Yeah.
from our solar system. Anyway, when the Voyager space probes were sent out, we envisaged alien life, if sufficiently advanced as to have developed space travel, they would inevitably be music fans, obviously. So a recording of parts of the Brandenburg Concertos is within the Voyager probes. And I think it's rather awkward to think of said extraterrestrial life finally arriving upon the Earth, certain of our wonderful qualities because of the great music that we sent to the stars, and eagerly asking, then in comics they say, send me to your leader. I see them as asking our representative, when finally a method of communication is established, could we please see the originals of your wonderful masterpiece? And tell me, how did you look after these exactly? In a drawer, 100 years later, library, bombed, jump out of train, shoved up the jumper. Sorry, aliens.
That's a hell of a story. And I I this is a first. I don't know if we're on episode 74, 75 or whatever, but Alex, I have just always given you the benefit of the doubt and assumed that all the stories from More Lessons of History, More Lessons from History, and from Lessons from History were true. But this one obviously cannot be, because if it were true, then in Star Trek the Motion Picture, when they finally
Vija.
captured V'ger, they
Yeah.
would have played the Brandenburg Concerto.
No, because that's Vija 6.
I see. Okay. Now
How's that on the spot side, on the spot Star Trek knowledge?
that's why they went with the Clash, I guess then. Okay, very good. Very good. So
Yeah.
any so where is the said document now? Do we know? It's in the Brandenburg
I think
Museum?
it's still in Brandenburg. Yeah.
Oh, amazing.
And Bach, the inventor of counterpoint and so forth. I love Bach, and I found that when I was an undergraduate, I'd listen to the concertos all the time, and I found it very soothing. I knew them well enough that I could concentrate on something else while they were playing. And then later, I found that they made me feel quite uncomfortable. And the reason was that they put me back in exam mode.
Ah,
They made me
right.
feel like I
Right.
was, and I wasn't a
Right.
great student, but they made me feel like I was getting ready for an exam that I might or might not have been ready for, as I definitely spent too much time down the pub and so forth. I do you know, I mean, this is not wildly off topic, but what's a podcast for if not being?
Right.
Do you ever think to yourself, I would be a much better student now than I was when I
Of
was a
course.
student? And youth is wasted on the young and all that. And but the things that these poor teachers were trying to teach me were objectively fascinating, and I was too busy, I don't know, chatting to
Absolutely.
people and drinking too much and so forth. Yeah,
Yeah. Well, now, not to get political, but we have parents in the United States and probably in the UK as well are paying $90,000 a year for 4 years at an elite university for their
right.
students to come walking across stage and show the Palestinian flag and have their diploma taken away from them.
Oh, I saw that. I thought that was a great shame. But I did admire I admire this, whatever the protest, when the university, which had not sanctioned the sit-in, um, did not allow, it was Harvard, wasn't it? Didn't allow people to join their graduating cohort. And I thought that that was a very powerful message about people who disrespect and dishonor their own institution to such an extent and degree. I mean, without getting into the details of people
Right. Right. Right.
who claim their human rights are being breached by you not supplying them with food when they could choose to leave at any time, which is
Right.
completely ridiculous. But um, there has to be consequences, because otherwise these people will carry on doing this forever, and universities will become a farce, and it'll become something at which um, you can just sit out forever. I mean, what for terms, so entire semesters, and then expect to get your degree. So I mean, I thought it was quite right of the university to take action, and I think it will send a message to students thinking about doing that the next time.
Well, and in addition to at UCLA, when they were claiming that they were being tortured because the police weren't giving them lattes, they also, I just learned in another space I was in earlier today that they were smuggling in Dunkin' Donuts by the boxes, and Dunkin' Donuts is one of the targets of their boycotts. So
How, I mean,
no
yeah,
accounting
really,
for hypocrisy.
yeah, quite. I mean, absolutely extraordinary. We're going to take a short break because we're going to get in our guest for second story.
Be right back with our special guest, everybody. We hope you enjoyed that musical interlude, ladies and gentlemen. A first on the Hidden History Happy Hour. And another first, my dear friend, Mr. Scott Bledsoe, is with us. We're sitting here in his recording studio. Scott, I'm unofficially calling it the Loxa Studio. Is that a good name, or do you have a name?
I haven't named it. That's really good, but I'm going to go with that. That's
All right.
good. Yeah.
Welcome to the
Yeah.
first day of the Loxa Music Studio. So Scott Bledsoe right here, very dear friend, also the supplier of the Uncle Nearest that we're enjoying right now. Cheers,
Yeah.
Alex.
Cheers.
And was one of my favorite bosses I've ever had. I was his general counsel at a little startup we did a couple of years ago.
Well, thank you.
Yep. And as a wedding present for my lovely bride and I, Lisa, Scott brought us out to enjoy his bountiful offerings here in God's country. We're right along the Montana-Idaho border. We are right near where A River Runs Through It was filmed, if anyone knows that oldie but classic.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to say, ladies and gentlemen, I know a lot of our listeners are overseas, but if you are fans of the TV show Yellowstone or any of the spin-off shows, this guy right here, Scott Bledsoe, is the real life John Dutton, except without the assholery and without the giant ranch in Montecito.
I
Get
don't know.
off my land. Get off my land.
But actually, none of that.
there's
Well,
some
go
truth
ahead,
to
sir.
Well, there's some truth to that. There's, I got a kick out of the writing of that show because it truly depicts what we go through every single day, whether it be the work with the Indian tribe, the state, the fish and game. I mean, everybody has some idea how your land is supposed to be managed. And I find it quite interesting being the owner.
As your lawyer, I should say without the murder, though.
We try to stay away from that, but there's times that hey, backhoe sounds good.
I will say we did go through some extensive hikes on Scott's beautiful property, which he is donating much of back to the United States Forest Service, which is also not the story for today, but a great story. And I did not see any bodies, but you did steer us carefully away from certain parts.
Well, we'll keep that confidential. How's
Yes.
that?
Now get
I want to
this.
talk about music. Scott, you
Yeah,
got a
none
music
of that
story.
is the reason Scott is here. The reason Scott is here takes us back many decades. And it also is highly relevant to things that are happening in the U.S. education system today. And it's also a great yarn. So, Scott, please tell us.
Well, Brian and I were chatting about our philosophies on education right now, and I'm pretty sure everybody is frustrated. And I'm pretty darn sure it's going to change over time with technology and with the appetite out there politically, and likewise. It's just time for some change, but let's stay off that one. What we were talking about was from a music perspective. I was frustrated with it way back in 1987. I was a lucky recipient of the first full ride scholarship that was given at the Lionel Hampton School of Music, which just so happens to be
Cheers.
at the University of Idaho. We're very fortunate to get a full ride and study with a guy named Dan Buckvich. Now, he's probably one of the only most famous, I would have to give, living composers right now, and I don't think many people would disagree with that. He's been hired to do many things around the world, but I really wanted to study with Dan, and I kind of was lucky and got to start with him early. Long story made short, I was frustrated with, while I was so happy to study with Dan, majority of the professors at that time were not happy at all with Dan because he was heavy in the jazz world. I was thinking popular music on my way to Los Angeles and very sure that melody had its place. And then I'll never forget Dan telling me, he goes, "Hey, check you out." He goes, "Go down to the library and find me how many books there are on melody and then find out how many books there are on harmony." He goes, "Trust me, you will be shocked." And sure enough, there was hardly any on melody. I think I found one. On harmony, there was hundreds. So his point was, if you could stay on melody and live that, it's probably a very healthy thing. And he goes, "By the way, I bet your dad is not whistling Webern or Wagner," which where I'm going with this, all those professors were so believing that they had to steer the culture of the student studying music into what they're calling 20th century music. It should be 20th, 21st century, ends 2000, I believe. Now they call it the modern. But they were not going to give Robert and Hammerstein any credit. They were not going to give anybody who had a melody you could whistle anything. And I remember Dan saying, "If you're walking down the road, Scott, and you can whistle it," he goes, "your dad would appreciate it, and you're probably on to melody."
And to our last segment, I'm sure Alex can whistle a lot of the Brandenburg Concerto, which we were just talking about.
One of my favorites, Baroque era. Yeah, so I went through. I had a wonderful time at the university. I would handwrite out a lot of script that I was writing, and Dan would assist me. He had an interesting music style of teaching. It was all about just do it, do not. I'll never go to class with him, but he will just sit there and teach me. But where it got interesting is towards the end of of my period at school, I did a lot of concerts, but I did quite a large one, about a 2.5 hour concert, and got special permission to do it in the what's called the Ad Auditorium. And nobody had done one in there before other than the purists and the classicalists. And so what ended up happening was interesting. We had a stand-up ovation type of performance, no seats in the house, but I wrote a rock opera, and I invited all of those professors who just were, in my opinion, did not give a darn about the future of melody.
Yeah.
the future of our students. All they cared about was their agenda. And I didn't know much other than it was a wonderful concert. We had a great time, except for the next morning, I got a knock on my door from my fraternity brothers, and they said, Scott, President Gibb, president of the university, needs to talk to you now. So I get dressed real quick, and I'm supposed to meet him up at his office. I get to his office. It's a gorgeous big room, dark panel. He's got his feet on the desk, and he says, Scott, I need you to come in. Before you do, make us both a scotch. So I walk over to his, and I'm shaking. I pour him a scotch, pour me a scotch, just sure I'd done something wrong. I had no idea. I'd never met with the president before. He goes, I went to your concert last night. I'm like, oh, shit. Because I had heard that somebody had found a beer can in there. And there was some sentiment back then that you just don't bring beer into these beautiful places.
Yeah.
And he said, you know what? And he slapped something down on the desk, and he said, Scott, read this. And it was a petition from all these teachers to kick me out of the University of Idaho after they had gone and listened to this musical opera I wrote called The Teacher.
Yeah. Ironic, right?
Which was written in all the lyrics about how they fundamentally are not teaching, but running their own agendas. And worse than that, if you think of it from a teacher who's supposed to make you rich, most of these folks were poor. So one has to sit back and go, what is that about? Now you could argue, well, that has a lot to do with the giving of their times and such. I was taking it deeper going, wait a minute, these are the folks that I did get 4.0 in their classes, but they couldn't stand that I liked melody. They also were trying to drive to the fact that we absolutely need to change anyone's thought of where we will look at the history of music during this 100-year period. And the only thing that should stand there is avant-garde or atonal music. So anyway, he goes on, he says, so what do you think? I'm like, well, I don't even know what to say. I've never been kicked out of a university before. He goes, well, here's the deal. He goes, I had the greatest time of my life. That was the greatest concert I've ever heard in that deal. I think you ought to tell me more about these professors. So I proceeded to tell him what I thought of each one, and it wasn't that nice. He says, I'm going to take care of that, and I really do appreciate it. Do you mind if I start the execution right away? And I said, no, do you mind if I have another scotch? And so I grabbed this scotch. We had one, toasted to that, and I walked out.
Cheers.
And he said, oh, one other thing. He said, before you head to Los Angeles, which I did immediately and started a recording studio down there. We can talk about that later if you'd like. But before I left, I have to have you do one more thing. He goes, I want you to represent the University of Idaho in our 200-year anniversary, and I need you to come back, and I also want you to do all the musicals before you leave. And I was on my way to jump on a car to head down to LA. So that meant I had to stay 3 more months to do summer school and to do things like Godspell and some of these things I'm really not the hugest fan of, but I did them. And God rest his soul, he died, unfortunately, right after that 200th anniversary. But anyway, it's nice to see that someone at that higher level understood the politics then, 1987,
right.
which has only gotten worse now, and in a much bigger way that we see, of course, on TV and everywhere.
Yeah. Who knew music had ideology? I guess we should have all guessed that.
And it's not the main takeaway, but I was in a production of Godspell and it's of its time. But I also enjoy it. I mean, I'm sure, like all the things, like Starlight Express is coming back here in the UK.
Yeah.
These things will come around again and again. And you know what Godspell does have? Melody.
And you know,
it's
really a weird coincidence you should mention that, Alex, because I was just watching a Donald Trump commercial today, and the tagline was "Prepare ye the way of the Lord." I don't know why that was in there. No, I'm kidding. It's not a real ad. Don't write letters. There's no ad. I made it up.
The funny thing is about this situation, I believed you.
Yeah, it's plausible, right?
Yeah.
So
this hasn't happened before. Well, we did have one song before on the podcast, but it's a prepare ye the way of the Lord. Prepare ye the way of the Lord.
Yes.
Guys, I could get on the skins back there. We could do this for real.
Brian, now you should mention that you're a drummer because many of our audience won't know that.
Yes. Well, not only was I a professional drummer for many years, not opening up for the Stones, but just paying my way through college and law school. But couple of nights ago, as it happens, my friend Scott and I and our lovely spouses were out on the town enjoying this beautiful Missoula, Montana, which I recommend to everybody to come visit. You won't be allowed to stay here, but that's too bad. And we got back to the studio, and Scott's, no, this is 12:50 a.m., by the way. Scott says, I have not dialed in the speakers in my studio with the new electronic drums I have over there. So we did.
At a decibel a little higher than I remembered my neighbor would remember himself. So.
And I kept
Right.
saying, Scott, should I just put the headphones on? And he's, no, I got to get these speakers set up. So now that Alex and Scott have demonstrated their musical talents, I'm not going to go do anything, but I do have to now elicit from Scott what you said about my drumming, which you had heard for the first time.
I thought you read the composer very well, which is a
That's-
talent, for a drummer. That's a talent.
It's my second favorite Brian drummer story, and I'm conscious that we're meandering, but I'm enjoying it. It's my second Brian drumming story, and my favorite is, Brian, that you played for your daughter's band.
Yes. So for those, I don't know if I've told this story here. I might not even be able to tell it with a straight face. My daughter, Katie, is a singer-songwriter. Scott has heard some of her stuff. You can find her, Katie J. Cunningham Music. She's amazing. She's in New York City. The last professional gig I've ever had till now, drumming, was being the drummer in her band when she did her CD release party at the Whiskey in Los Angeles.
I've been there many times, played there many times.
Isn't
And
that great?
for her, I'm sure she just wanted to save the money and didn't want to hire a drummer. But imagine this. We're all fathers here. Alex is a brand new father, by the way. He's got a
Congratulations.
great young man.
Thank you very much.
Oh,
Thank
that's
you very much.
awesome.
Henry, 4 months old.
Awesome.
I'm sitting there in what I believe the best seat in the house, right between the bass and guitar.
Okay.
And she's performing 2 weeks before my oldest daughter went off to college. And I got to sit there and play. And it was,
That's pretty cool.
there was no dry eye on the drummer's throne. Let's just say that. Well,
That's
that came
nice.
out strange. I was crying, put it that way.
I didn't have as much fun. That digital revolution hit right about the time we opened our studio in the late 80s. You'll remember that was a big time for music. And we ended up making all of our money, what we thought was going to be rock and roll and, doing some wonderful recordings. And we did plenty, but it moved over to television and video at that period. And so I never forget, I had a beautiful isolation booth that we had spent a lot of money to get just right. Hell, we even had Barbara Streisand in there once. And that was a bitch in of itself. We'll have to talk about that because her nose didn't like the cedar that I had in there.
Oh, boy.
So we had to rip. Anyway, worse than ripping the cedar out for Barbara Streisand was having to put sand on the entire beautiful hardwood floors in boxes and permanently do it to record David Hasselhoff running through the sand for Baywatch.
You did the Baywatch. So
Hawk.
that was you.
I did. And while there's more money in that than what we were doing, I ended up selling the studio to a producer friend because that was the future at that period, it looked pretty grim. And that's how I got back into high techs.
But give us a sense of the kind of artists you were working with in that time.
I was really blessed.
Drummer, I recall.
I was so blessed because I was a writer and a composer, and it was a lot of fun to realize how few great artists don't compose.
Right.
And so you'd ended up having some really great players go, hey, man, do you mind if I sit in? Do you mind if I sit in? Or even better yet, you're in a session and this is what happens in these studios. Somebody got too much of this or other things and didn't show up. And then you had to call in somebody. And at some point, you're in the network. And when you're in the network, that's fun. My all-time favorite was we needed a drummer one night. And the guy that owned this particular studio gave me a list of names. And one of them was Stuart Copeland. And I'm like, we got out Stuart.
From the Police.
So from the Police. So Stuart showed up that night, just came and just had a ball, just a super, super guy. Another favorite moment was when I got a call to go down to the Mint. The Mint is a little tiny place in Pico Boulevard. And if you go to the Mint, you're going because you're in the know, you're in the network, and they're doing some test of some, piece of music or some great's going to do something. And I got a call to come down and take a peek at Bob Dylan. He called and said, hey, I want you and a couple of your engineers to come down and listen to something. I think you'll enjoy it. I'll pick up the tab. It's on me. So we go down to the Mint, see Bob, and he was announcing for the first time, and it was like 12 people band. It was not sounding good at all, but the Wallflowers.
Amazing.
And I'll be damned.
Bob Dylan's son's band, Jacob
Right.
Dylan. Yeah.
Yeah. Really. And so Bob goes, hey, what do you think? I'm like, too big a band, not so sure this is going to work. But I'll be damned, I was wrong, and good for him that they have, in my opinion, a little better pitch than Bob. But I love the guy as a writer and I love the guy as a person. I'm so glad to have met him. So I could tell you stories like that day in and day out, but that's what happens when you are finally in a network.
Thanks, everybody. Cheers.
Thanks very much. Cheers. Thanks, Scott. Bye-bye.
Alex, great talking to you. Bye-bye.
You too.